Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Booray Explains, and in this episode we're going to talk about the exposure triangle. This is the second episode in my series. The first one, the last episode I did was exposure, explaining what exposure is. So now we're going to talk about the exposure triangle, and this is actually kind of a tricky one to talk about, to be honest, because I don't want to get into the details of what these three things do. That's going to come up in another video. I just want to give you the broad understanding of what the exposure triangle is and what the term means when people talk about the exposure triangle. Okay, exposure. We talked about that in the last video. So we've got to get the correct exposure in our camera. How do we do that? There are three things that affect your exposure. And those three things are the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. Three things. These three things make up the exposure triangle. It's just a fancy word is all. Here's how people draw it. It looks like this. You see that? You'll see this sometimes, this graphic. The exposure triangle. This is the exposure triangle, like some magic Horcrux that you use in photography. It's really not. It's pretty simple. It's basically just the idea that there are three things that affect exposure. And each one of them affects exposure in a different way, or it has a different effect, a different side effect, I should say. And we'll talk about that in subsequent videos. But as far as understanding the exposure triangle goes, all you need to know is that there are three things. And that's the general idea that they're trying to get across when they talk about the exposure triangle, is that they want you as a photographer to understand there are three things that affect your exposure, not just one. If you want to change your exposure, you can change it with your aperture. You can change it with your shutter speed. You can change it with your ISO. Any one of those three things will affect your exposure. Because all three of them will affect your exposure, they can offset each other. And this is very important to understand too. So if you change your aperture in your camera to make your exposure different, you can then change your exposure back to the original settings by changing your ISO or changing your shutter speed or changing both of them. It doesn't matter. It's a triangle. All three of them work together. So if you let in twice as much light using your aperture, you can then take away that light using your shutter speed. Or you can take away half that light using your shutter speed and half that light using your ISO. Or you can take away all of that light using your ISO. You can do whatever you want. In the end, all that matters is that each one of those three settings, when combined, gives you the correct amount of light, gives you the correct exposure. That is the exposure triangle. It's a fancy word and a fancy definition just to let you know there's three things that affect your exposure. ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Those three things work together in a nice balancing act. Some lets in more light, some lets in less light. They all work together until you get just the right amount of light, until you get the correct exposure. All right? We got that? All right, keep watching. More videos will follow this one that will detail all kinds of different terms and terminology in photography and help make you a better photographer. And be sure and check my podcast out. It's called Photobomb. It's available anywhere that podcasts are found. And join my group on Facebook. It is called Pro Photo Talk with Booray Perry. It's a great community. And follow me on Instagram. My Instagram link is below. Also, don't forget, also below in the links, you will find links to all of my gear. So if you're interested in photography gear, and most photographers are huge photography gear nerds, be sure and check out that link and take a look at all of the gear that I carry and help support this channel. Thanks for watching.